Jake Harrison adjusted his dress uniform one last time before entering the courthouse. The blue fabric felt stiff against his shoulders, and the weight of his medals pressed against his chest. He had not worn the uniform in months, but today was special. His neighbor Tony needed a character witness for his custody battle, and Jake wanted to show respect for the court. The Medal of Honor hung around his neck, its blue ribbon catching the morning light. Jake touched it briefly, remembering the day he received it from the president himself. The memory of Kepler-7 flashed through his mind, but he pushed it away. Today was about helping Tony keep his kids, not about old battles on distant worlds. The courthouse buzzed with activity. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past, carrying thick folders and speaking in hushed voices. Families sat on wooden benches, some looking hopeful, others worried. Jake found Tony near the back of the main hallway. His friend looked nervous, tugging at his tie every few seconds. "Thanks for coming, Jake," Tony said, shaking his hand. "I know you hate wearing the uniform." Jake smiled. "It is fine. Your kids need you. That matters more than my comfort." They walked into courtroom B together. The room smelled of old wood and cleaning supplies. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light. About 30 people filled the gallery, most of them family members and witnesses. Jake took a seat in the third row, behind Tony and his lawyer. Judge Patricia Wells entered through a side door. She was a thin woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her black robe swished as she walked to the bench. Everyone stood until she sat down and banged her gavel once. "Be seated," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. The hearing began with Tony's ex-wife and her lawyer presenting their case. They claimed Tony was unstable and unfit to have joint custody of his 2 children. Jake listened to the lies with growing anger, but kept his face calm. He had learned patience in the Marines. After an hour, Tony's lawyer called Jake to the witness stand. He stood and walked forward, his military bearing evident in every step. The gallery murmured as people noticed his uniform and medals. Some pointed at the Medal of Honor, whispering to each other about what it meant. Jake placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. He sat in the witness chair and looked at Tony's lawyer, ready to testify about his friend's character. But before the first question came, Judge Wells spoke up. "Excuse me, witness," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet courtroom. "What is that thing around your neck?" Jake looked down at his Medal of Honor, then back at the judge. "It is the Medal of Honor, Your Honor. I received it for actions during the Battle of Kepler-7. Judge Wells frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I find it inappropriate and disrespectful to wear such decorations in my courtroom. You are clearly trying to show off and influence the jury with your military background." The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing. Jake felt his heart begin to race but kept his voice steady. "Your Honor, this is my dress uniform. Military regulations require me to wear all authorized decorations when in dress uniform." "There is no jury here, young man," Judge Wells snapped. "This is a family court hearing, not a military parade. Remove that medal immediately or I will hold you in contempt of court." Jake's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, my client has every legal right to wear his military decorations. The Medal of Honor is the highest decoration for valor in the United States military." Judge Wells turned her glare on the lawyer. "Counselor, I decide what is appropriate in my courtroom. Your client is trying to use his military service to unfairly influence these proceedings. I will not allow it." Several people in the gallery gasped. An older man in the back row stood up. "Judge, that man is a hero. He saved my daughter on Kepler-7. Sit down and be quiet or I will have you removed," Judge Wells said without looking at the man. She turned back to Jake. "Remove the medal now or spend the night in jail for contempt." Jake felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. He thought about the 12 Marines who died on Kepler-7, about the children he saved, about the oath he swore to defend the Constitution. But he also thought about Tony's kids and how his arrest might hurt their father's case. With slow, deliberate movements, Jake reached up and lifted the Medal of Honor over his head. His hand shook slightly as he folded it and placed it on the rail in front of him. The blue ribbon looked small and ordinary lying there, separated from its meaning. "Better," Judge Wells said with satisfaction. "Now, counselor, you may proceed with your questioning." But before Tony's lawyer could speak, phones started buzzing throughout the gallery. Several people had been recording the exchange, and the videos were already uploading to social media. Within minutes, the footage would spread across human space and beyond. Jake answered questions about Tony's character for 20 minutes. He spoke about his friend's love for his children, his steady work record, and his volunteer work with veterans. But his mind kept drifting to the medal sitting in front of him, stripped of its dignity by judicial ignorance. When the questioning ended, Jake picked up his Medal of Honor and walked back to his seat. The judge's eyes followed him, but she said nothing more. The hearing continued for another hour, with more witnesses testifying for both sides. Tony's ex-wife took the stand and painted him as an angry, violent man. She claimed he yelled at the children and drank too much. Jake knew these were lies, but sat quietly as the woman destroyed his friend's reputation with practiced ease. Finally, Judge Wells announced she would review all testimony and issue her decision in 1 week. The courtroom began to empty, but Jake remained seated. He stared at the medal in his hands, thinking about what had just happened. Tony approached him as the room cleared. "Jake, I am sorry about what she did. That was wrong." Jake looked up at his friend. "Do not worry about me. Focus on your kids." But even as he said the words, Jake felt something changing inside him. The disrespect shown to his medal was also disrespect shown to every Marine who served. Every family who lost someone in the war against the Zephyrians. Every child who lived because brave men and women stood between them and death. As they left the courthouse together, neither man knew that the videos from the courtroom were already viral. News networks across the galaxy were picking up the story of a judge who ordered a war hero to remove his Medal of Honor. The reaction would be swift and devastating, but that was still hours away. For now, Jake Harrison simply walked to his car, placed his medal carefully in the glove compartment, and drove home to wait for the storm that was coming. 3 years earlier, Lieutenant Jake Harrison stood on the observation deck of the transport ship heading to Kepler-7. The mining colony appeared as a small dot against the purple-tinged atmosphere of the planet below. Jake commanded a 12-man reconnaissance unit tasked with checking security at the remote settlement. Intelligence suggested Zephyrian raiders might target the colony, but no one expected a full-scale attack. Kepler-7 housed 3,000 civilians, mostly miners and their families. The colony produced rare metals essential for human starship construction. Without these materials, humanity's expansion into space would slow dramatically. The colony had basic defenses, but nothing that could stop a determined alien assault. Jake's Marines were young and eager, most of them fresh from training. Sergeant Bill Murphy was the only veteran in the group, having served 2 tours on border worlds. The others looked to Jake and Murphy for guidance, trusting their officers to keep them safe and complete the mission. The transport landed at the colony's main spaceport just after sunrise. Colony Administrator Karen White met them at the landing pad. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and worried eyes. The stress of managing a frontier settlement showed in every line of her face. "Lieutenant Harrison," she said, shaking his hand, "thank you for coming. We have been nervous about Zephyrian activity in the sector." Jake nodded. "My men will conduct a full security survey. We should have preliminary recommendations by tomorrow evening." The colony spread across a wide valley between 2 mountain ranges. Prefabricated buildings housed the miners and their families, while massive excavation equipment worked the open pit mines. Children played in small parks between the residential blocks, their laughter echoing off the metal walls of their homes. Jake spent the first day walking through the settlement with Administrator White. The colony's defenses were minimal, a few automated gun turrets and a small security force of 20 guards. Against human pirates or raiders, these might suffice. Against the Zephyrian Empire's military technology, they were useless. That evening, Jake filed his initial report to Marine Command. He recommended immediate reinforcement with at least 2 companies of Marines and heavy weapons. The colony was too valuable and too vulnerable to leave undefended. But the reply came back negative. All available forces were committed to operations closer to Earth. On the second morning, long-range sensors detected incoming ships. The colony's communications officer, a nervous young man named Pete Collins, ran to find Jake in the administrative building. His face was pale with fear as he delivered the news. "Lieutenant, we have multiple contacts approaching from deep space," Pete said, his voice shaking. "The computer identifies them as Zephyrian assault ships." Jake felt his stomach drop. 12 Marines against a Zephyrian assault force meant certain death for everyone in the colony. But running was not an option. The transport that brought them would not return for 6 days. Even if they could call for help, reinforcements would arrive too late. How many ships? Jake asked, keeping his voice calm. 15, sir. Full battlecruisers with fighter escorts. Jake did quick math in his head. Each Zephyrian battlecruiser carried about 20 warriors plus support crew. The fighters would provide air support and prevent escape. Against 300 alien soldiers with advanced weapons and armor, his small unit had no chance of victory. But victory was not the goal anymore. The goal was time. Jake gathered his Marines in the colony's main conference room. The men sat around a metal table, their faces grim as he explained the situation. Some looked scared, others angry, but all remained focused on their duty. "We cannot win this fight," Jake said honestly, "but we can buy time for the civilians to escape. The old mining tunnels in the northern mountains go deep underground. If we can hold the Zephyrians for 72 hours, the civilians can reach safety." Sergeant Murphy spoke up. "What about extraction, sir? How do we get out?" Jake looked at each man in turn. "We do not get out, Sergeant. This is a one-way mission." The room fell silent. Jake watched his Marines process this information. Some were barely 20 years old with their whole lives ahead of them. Others had families waiting at home. All of them had volunteered to serve humanity, but none had expected to die on a mining colony light years from Earth. Private Danny Lewis, the youngest member of the unit, raised his hand. "Sir, what about the evacuation ships?" "There are no evacuation ships coming," Jake replied. "The Navy cannot reach us in time. The civilians will have to travel through the mountains on foot and hope for rescue later." For several minutes, no one spoke. Then Sergeant Murphy stood up. "Sir, I have been fighting aliens for 5 years. I am tired of running from them. If we are going to die here, let us make it count." One by one, the other Marines nodded their agreement. They would stand and fight, not because they had any hope of survival, but because it was their duty to protect innocent people. Jake felt a surge of pride in these young men who chose honor over self-preservation. The Zephyrian ships entered orbit 6 hours later. Their first action was to destroy the colony's communications array and landing pad, cutting off any hope of outside help or escape. Then the invasion began. Zephyrian dropships descended like angry wasps, disgorging alien warriors in powered armor. The creatures stood 7 feet tall, with 4 arms and reptilian features. Their weapons fired bolts of superheated plasma that could melt through steel. They moved with the confidence of a superior force facing helpless prey. Jake positioned his Marines at key choke points throughout the colony. They would not try to hold the entire settlement, that was impossible. Instead, they would conduct a fighting retreat, forcing the Zephyrians to advance slowly while civilians escaped through the northern passages. The first engagement came at the main gate. Corporal Steve Johnson and 2 privates held a barricade position, their rifles cracking in measured volleys. The Zephyrians advanced in perfect formation, their plasma weapons lighting up the afternoon sky. Johnson's team held for 20 minutes before falling back to the next position. Jake coordinated the defense from the colony's command center. Reports flowed in from his scattered Marines as they traded space for time. Each position held as long as possible before retreating to prepared fallback points. The Zephyrians advanced steadily, but much slower than they had expected. By nightfall on the first day, half the colony was in alien hands. But Administrator White reported that most of the civilians had reached the mountain tunnels safely. Families huddled in the dark passages, carrying whatever supplies they could manage. Children cried softly while their parents tried to remain hopeful. Jake's force was down to 9 men. 3 Marines had died holding the eastern approach, their sacrifice buying precious hours for the evacuation. The survivors were exhausted, low on ammunition, and facing an enemy that grew stronger with each passing hour. But they held on. Through the second day and into the second night, the Marines continued their deadly game of advance and retreat. They used every trick Jake had learned in military school, every tactic Sergeant Murphy had picked up in years of combat. They turned the colony into a maze of kill zones and ambush points. The Zephyrians grew frustrated with the stubborn resistance. These were supposed to be easy targets. Human soldiers were known to break and run when faced with superior firepower. Instead, they found disciplined troops who fought with desperate skill and refused to surrender. On the morning of the 3rd day, Jake received word that the last group of civilians had cleared the danger zone. 3,000 people were safely hidden in the mountain caves beyond the reach of Zephyrian ground forces. The mission was complete. Jake gathered his remaining 7 Marines in the colony's central plaza. They were dirty, exhausted, and nearly out of ammunition, but their eyes still burned with determination. Around them, the empty buildings of Kepler-7 stood as silent witnesses to their sacrifice. "Gentlemen," Jake said, "we have done what we came to do. The civilians are safe." The final battle lasted 6 hours as the Zephyrians threw everything they had at the remaining Marines. The video spread across the galactic communication network faster than anyone expected. Within 6 hours of leaving the courthouse, Jake Harrison's humiliation had reached every human colony, space station, and military outpost. But the footage did not stop at human borders. It crossed into alien space as well, reaching species that had fought alongside humanity against the Zephyrian threat. Ambassador Lisa Carter was reviewing trade agreements in her office on Centaura Prime when her aide rushed in with a data pad. The young woman's face was pale with shock as she showed Carter the viral video. Carter watched in disbelief as Judge Wells ordered a Medal of Honor recipient to remove his decoration like a schoolchild being punished. "How many views does this have?" Carter asked, her voice tight with anger. 50 million and climbing, ma'am," her aide replied. "It is trending on every major news platform across human space." Carter sank into her chair, already calculating the diplomatic damage. The Centauran Federation had been humanity's closest ally since first contact 20 years ago. The bird-like aliens respected courage and honor above all other virtues. To them, the Medal of Honor represented the highest form of recognition a warrior could receive. Her communication system chimed with an incoming call from Centauran Prime Minister Kextar. The alien leader's blue-feathered face filled the screen, his golden eyes burning with indignation. When Centaurans were angry, their feathers stood up straight, making them appear larger and more intimidating. Right now, Kextar looked furious. "Ambassador Carter," he said, his translated voice carrying clear disapproval, "we have seen the disgraceful treatment of your war hero. Is this how humanity honors those who shed blood for others?" Carter chose her words carefully. "Prime Minister, this was an isolated incident involving one misguided judge. It does not represent human values or our respect for military service." Kextar's feathers ruffled even more. "We Centaurans judge a species by how they treat their warriors. This human, Jake Harrison, saved thousands of lives on Kepler-7. Our military advisors studied his tactics and found them brilliant, yet your own people humiliate him in public." The conversation continued for 20 minutes with Carter trying to explain that Judge Wells did not speak for all humanity, but she could see the doubt in Kextar's eyes. The Centaurans valued honor and dignity above everything else. To them, the courthouse incident revealed a fundamental flaw in human character. Similar calls came from other allied species throughout the day. The Free Worlds Alliance expressed shock and disappointment. The Andromedan Collective questioned whether humans could be trusted to honor agreements if they could not honor their own heroes. Even neutral species began to wonder about humanity's commitment to shared values. Dr. Kevin Walsh, Director of Interspecies Relations, called an emergency meeting of all human ambassadors. The holographic conference room filled with worried faces as diplomats reported growing tensions with their alien counterparts. What had started as a local news story was becoming a galactic crisis. "The situation is worse than we thought," Dr. Walsh began. 3 different species have postponed trade negotiations. The Rigel Consortium is reconsidering their defense alliance. Even species that have never shown interest in human affairs are asking questions about our values. Ambassador Julia Brooks from the Vegan system spoke up. "My contacts say alien news networks are running the courthouse footage on repeat. They are calling it evidence that humans have lost respect for sacrifice and honor." The meeting continued for 3 hours as ambassadors shared reports from across known space. The consensus was clear. Humanity's reputation was suffering massive damage. Species that had viewed humans as reliable allies now questioned their character and commitment. But the most troubling news came from intelligence sources monitoring Zephyrian communications. Agent Rick Stone from Military Intelligence joined the conference to share intercepted transmissions from enemy space. His report made everyone's blood run cold. "The Zephyrians are using this footage in their propaganda broadcasts," Stone explained. "They are telling human colonies that even Earth no longer values military service. Their message is that resistance is pointless because humanity has lost the will to fight. The propaganda was already having an effect. Several border colonies reported increased defection rates as civilians lost faith in military protection. Some colonists were even considering surrender negotiations with Zephyrian representatives, believing their own government had abandoned them. Captain Laura Freeman from the USS Defender sent a priority message to Earth Command, describing the situation in her patrol sector. Morale among her crew had dropped significantly after watching the courthouse video. Young officers questioned whether their service meant anything if society could treat heroes with such disrespect. "Admiral," Captain Freeman wrote, "my sailors are asking if this is what we are fighting for. If a judge can humiliate a Medal of Honor recipient, what value does our sacrifice have? I have never seen morale this low in 20 years of service." Similar reports came from military units across human space. Recruitment offices reported a sharp drop in volunteers, while veterans organizations canceled public ceremonies rather than risk similar humiliation. The psychological impact was spreading through human society like a virus. Meanwhile, civilian reaction was mixed but intense. Social media exploded with arguments between those defending Jake Harrison and others supporting Judge Wells. Some people called for the judge's removal from office, while others claimed the veteran was grandstanding and deserved criticism. News anchor Sam Roberts covered the story on his evening broadcast, trying to remain neutral, but clearly struggling with the implications. "The question facing humanity tonight is simple," he said, looking directly into the camera. "How do we treat our heroes, and what does that say about who we are as a species?" The answer seemed to depend on who was asking. Military families rallied around Jake Harrison, organizing protests and letter-writing campaigns. Veterans posted their own videos explaining what the Medal of Honor meant and why Judge Wells's actions were so harmful. Active duty service members shared stories of their own experiences with civilian disrespect. But other voices pushed back, claiming that military service did not give anyone special privileges in civilian court. Some legal experts supported Judge Wells, arguing that uniformed individuals could intimidate other participants in legal proceedings. A few anti-war groups even praised the judge for standing up to what they called military intimidation. The debate raged across human space, dividing families and communities. What everyone agreed on was that the incident had exposed deep tensions about the role of military service in civilian society. These tensions had been building for years, but Jake Harrison's courthouse humiliation brought them into the open. Foreign intelligence services watched the human debate with great interest. The Zephyrians increased their monitoring of human communications, looking for signs of weakness they could exploit. Other species wondered if humanity was strong enough to remain a reliable ally in an uncertain galaxy. General Mark Thompson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, held daily briefings about the crisis. Military planners worried that the damage to morale and recruitment could affect readiness levels within months. Some units were already reporting discipline problems as soldiers questioned their mission and purpose. "This is bigger than one judge or one veteran," General Thompson told his staff. "This is about whether human civilization values the people who defend it. If we cannot answer that question clearly, we may not survive the next Zephyrian offensive." As the first week after the courthouse incident ended, the full scope of the crisis became clear. What had started as a local legal proceeding had become a test of human character and values. The galaxy was watching to see how humanity would respond, and the stakes could not be higher. In diplomatic channels, alien leaders pressed for explanations and assurances. In military units, officers struggled to maintain morale and focus. In civilian society, the debate grew more heated each day, and somewhere in enemy space, Zephyrian war planners studied the chaos and began making new attack plans based on perceived human weakness. Ryan Brooks had been an investigative journalist for 15 years, but he had never seen a story explode like this one. The courthouse video landed on his desk 3 hours after it went viral, sent by a tip from a source who knew Brooks specialized in military affairs. As he watched Judge Wells humiliate Jake Harrison, Brooks felt his investigative instincts kick into high gear. Something about the judge's behavior seemed wrong beyond the obvious disrespect. Brooks had covered dozens of court cases over the years, and he recognized the signs of personal bias. Judge Wells was not just enforcing courtroom decorum, she was targeting military service specifically. The way she spoke, The satisfaction in her voice when Jake removed his medal suggested deeper motivations. Brooks started his investigation the old-fashioned way, by reading everything he could find about Judge Patricia Wells. Her official biography was impressive. Law degree from Harvard, 20 years of legal experience, appointed to the federal bench 5 years ago. But Brooks looked deeper, searching for patterns in her judicial record that might reveal hidden prejudices. The first red flag appeared when Brooks analyzed Wells's sentencing data from the past 3 years. Veterans appearing before her court received sentences 20% longer than the national average for similar crimes. Military families lost custody battles at twice the normal rate when Wells presided. Service members seeking disability benefits were denied more often in her court than in any other jurisdiction. Brooks called his research assistant, Amy Chen, to help dig through thousands of court documents. Amy was a recent journalism graduate with a talent for data analysis and an obsession with finding hidden patterns. Together, they began building a comprehensive picture of Judge Wells' judicial behavior. "Look at this," Amy said, pointing to her computer screen. "In the past year, Judge Wells has ruled against veterans in 92% of their cases. The state average is 68%. Brooks leaned over to study the numbers. The pattern was undeniable. Judge Wells had a clear bias against military personnel and their families. But bias alone was not necessarily illegal. Judges were human and could have personal opinions. What Brooks needed was evidence of corruption or misconduct. The breakthrough came when Amy discovered unusual financial activity in Judge Wells's bank records. Public disclosure forms required judges to report their investments and income sources, but Wells had been less than complete in her filings. A cross-reference with property records revealed she owned a vacation home in Florida that never appeared on her disclosure forms. How does a federal judge afford a $2 million beach house on a government salary? Brooks asked. He had covered enough corruption cases to know that unexplained wealth was often the key to larger scandals. Amy dug deeper into Wells's financial history, using public records and Freedom of Information requests to trace money flows. What she found was a complex web of payments and investments that seemed designed to hide their true source. The vacation home was purchased through a shell company, which received funding from another shell company, which ultimately traced back to a lobbying firm in Washington. The lobbying firm, Political Solutions Incorporated, specialized in what they called Veterans Affairs advocacy. But their actual client list told a different story. They represented insurance companies fighting disability claims, corporations resisting veterans' hiring preferences, and law firms that specialized in challenging military benefits. Brooks arranged a meeting with his editor, Frank Morrison, to discuss the investigation. Morrison was a veteran journalist who had broken several major corruption stories during his career. He listened carefully as Brooks explained the financial connections between Judge Wells and anti-military interests. "You're onto something big here," Morrison said, leaning back in his chair. "But you need more than financial records. You need witnesses, documents, something that proves deliberate misconduct." Brooks spent the next week interviewing lawyers who had appeared before Judge Wells. Most were reluctant to speak on the record, fearing retaliation from a powerful federal judge, but gradually, a picture emerged of systematic bias and questionable behavior in cases involving military personnel. Attorney Lisa Wang represented several veterans seeking disability benefits in Wells's court. She agreed to speak anonymously about her experiences. "Judge Wells would ask inappropriate questions about military service," Wang explained. "She once asked my client if he enjoyed killing people overseas. That has nothing to do with disability law." Other lawyers shared similar stories. Judge Wells would make snide comments about military discipline, question whether veterans deserved special consideration, and consistently interpret laws in ways that harmed service members and their families. The pattern was clear to anyone who practiced regularly in her court. Brooks also interviewed court staff members who witnessed Wells's behavior behind the scenes. A court clerk, speaking on condition of anonymity, described how the judge would laugh about military cases and make jokes about professional killers seeking sympathy from taxpayers. She called one Purple Heart recipient a glorified welfare recipient after he left her. Courtroom, the clerk revealed. "I have never seen a judge show such open hostility toward any group of people." The financial investigation continued in parallel with witness interviews. Amy discovered that Judge Wells's brother-in-law, Robert Chen, ran a law firm called Veterans Legal Services. Despite its name, the firm actually specialized in challenging veterans' claims and reducing benefit payments. Chen's firm had received over $5 million in payments from insurance companies and government contractors in the past 2 years. The connection became clearer when Brooks found email records showing coordination between Judge Wells and her brother-in-law's firm. While the communications were carefully worded to avoid obvious illegality, they suggested a pattern of sharing information about upcoming cases and legal strategies. Meanwhile, Congressional Representative Helen Murphy had been watching the courthouse video with growing anger. Murphy was an Army veteran who served 2 tours in Afghanistan before entering politics. She understood the significance of Jake Harrison's Medal of Honor and the damage Judge Wells had caused to military morale. "This is bigger than one judge's bias," Murphy told her chief of staff. "This is about whether we protect the people who protect us." Murphy used her position on the House Veterans Affairs Committee to launch a formal investigation into Judge Wells's conduct. She subpoenaed financial records, court transcripts, and communications related to military cases. The investigation would have legal authority that Brooks's journalism could not match. The committee's first hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks after the courthouse incident. Murphy's staff worked around the clock to gather evidence and identify witnesses. They coordinated with Brooks and other journalists to ensure all relevant information was available for the hearing. Dr. Sarah Wilson, a military psychologist who had testified in several of Wells' cases, agreed to appear before the committee. She had witnessed the judge's bias firsthand and was willing to speak publicly about its impact on veterans seeking help. Judge Wells created a hostile environment for any veteran appearing in her court, Dr. Wilson would later testify. Her questions and comments were designed to humiliate and intimidate people who had already suffered trauma in service to their country. As news of the congressional investigation spread, more witnesses came forward. Veterans who had been mistreated in Wells' court contacted Murphy's office to share their stories. Lawyers provided documents showing patterns of bias and misconduct. Court staff members offered to testify about behavior they had observed but never reported. The scope of the investigation expanded as evidence mounted. What had started as a single incident of judicial misconduct was revealing a systematic campaign to undermine veterans' rights and military morale. The courthouse humiliation of Jake Harrison was just the most visible example of a larger problem. Brooks published his first major article about Judge Wells 1 week after the courthouse incident. The headline read, "Pattern of Bias, Federal Judges' War on Veterans." The article detailed the financial connections, witness testimonies, and statistical evidence of systematic discrimination against military personnel. The article went viral almost immediately, generating millions of views and thousands of comments. Legal experts called for Wells' immediate suspension pending investigation. Veterans organizations demanded criminal charges. Even some judges who normally defended judicial independence spoke out against Wells' conduct. Judge Wells issued a brief statement through her attorney, denying any wrongdoing and claiming she was the victim of a politically motivated attack. But the evidence was mounting and public pressure was growing. The investigation had taken on a life of its own, driven by years of accumulated anger about the treatment of veterans in civilian society. The deeper investigators dug into Judge Wells's activities, the more they realized her anti-military bias was not an isolated problem. FBI agent Maria Santos had been assigned to the case after Ryan Brooks's article revealed potential criminal violations. What Santos discovered was a sophisticated network of individuals and organizations working to undermine military morale and veteran support. Across the country, Santos started her investigation by following the money trail that Brooks had uncovered. The shell companies funding Judge Wells's lifestyle led to a Washington lobbying firm, but that was just the beginning. The firm received funding from a dozen different sources, all with one thing in common: they profited when military personnel and veterans received less support from society. The network included insurance companies that fought disability claims, corporations that resisted veterans' hiring preferences, and legal firms that specialized in challenging military benefits. But the most disturbing discovery was the involvement of a think tank called the Institute for Peace and Prosperity, which claimed to promote nonviolent solutions to global conflicts. Dr. Richard Cross ran the institute from an expensive office building in downtown Washington. His organization published studies questioning the value of military spending and promoted policies that would reduce the social status of military service. Cross argued that honoring military heroes encouraged a culture of violence that made peaceful solutions to conflicts less likely. Agent Santos obtained a warrant to search the Institute's financial records. What she found was a sophisticated operation funded by foreign sources, including shell companies traced back to countries that opposed American military expansion. The Institute was essentially a propaganda operation disguised as academic research. The Institute's activities went far beyond publishing anti-military studies. They funded sympathetic judges, prosecutors, and politicians who would implement policies harmful to military personnel. Judge Wells was just one of dozens of officials, receiving payments through various front organizations and consulting contracts. Santos discovered that Judge Wells had received over $300,000 in speaking fees from organizations connected to the Institute. She gave speeches about reducing military privilege in civilian society and ending hero worship culture. These payments were carefully structured to avoid obvious bribery charges, but they clearly influenced her judicial decisions. The conspiracy reached into other areas of government as well. Veterans Affairs officials who denied benefit claims received consulting fees from Institute-connected organizations. Prosecutors who pursued harsh sentences against military personnel were invited to expensive conferences and seminars. School administrators who restricted military recruiting on campus received grants for peace education programs. Meanwhile, Congressional Representative Helen Murphy's investigation was uncovering similar patterns from a different angle. Her committee's subpoena power allowed access to government records that journalists and FBI agents could not obtain easily. What they found was evidence of coordination between anti-military activists and government officials at the highest levels. Murphy's staff discovered internal memos from the Department of Veterans Affairs, discussing strategies to reduce benefit payments by implementing stricter eligibility requirements. The memos referenced advice from Institute for Peace and Prosperity consultants about how to reframe military service as a personal choice rather than a societal sacrifice. The committee also found evidence that certain members of Congress had received Institute funding for their campaigns. These politicians consistently voted against military pay raises, veteran benefits, and defense appropriations. They justified their positions using talking points developed by Institute researchers and distributed through their network of sympathetic media contacts. Admiral Carl Rogers, Chief of Naval Operations, testified before Murphy's committee about the broader implications of the anti-military campaign. Rogers was a decorated veteran who had commanded fleets in multiple conflicts against alien threats. His testimony carried significant weight with both committee members and the public. What we are seeing is not random bias against military service, Admiral Rogers explained. This is a coordinated attack on the institutions that defend human civilization. The timing is particularly dangerous, given the ongoing Zephyrian threat and our need for military readiness. Rogers presented classified intelligence showing that enemy propaganda increasingly focused on divisions within human society. Zephyrian broadcasts to border colonies emphasized how military personnel were losing respect on Earth, suggesting that resistance was futile because even human leaders had abandoned their defenders. The Admiral's testimony was supported by reports from military commanders across human space. Morale problems were spreading beyond individual units to entire fleets and army groups. Young officers questioned whether their service was valued by the society they protected. Recruitment numbers dropped month after month as the courthouse incident and subsequent revelations dominated news coverage. Agent Santos expanded her investigation to include other judges who had received Institute funding. She discovered a network of federal and state judges who consistently ruled against military personnel and veterans. Their decisions created a hostile legal environment that discouraged veterans from seeking benefits they had earned through their service. Judge Robert Kim in California had received similar payments to Judge Wells and showed similar bias in his courtroom. Veterans appearing before him faced hostile questioning about their motives for military service. and whether they deserved special consideration in civilian court. His rulings consistently favored insurance companies and corporations over disabled veterans seeking compensation. Judge Mary Foster in Texas had received institute funding through her husband's consulting firm. She routinely dismissed veterans' discrimination claims and ruled that military experience was not relevant to civilian employment disputes. Her decisions made it nearly impossible for veterans to prove they had been unfairly treated because of their service. The pattern extended beyond individual judges to entire court systems. Legal clerks who worked for institute-funded judges reported being instructed to research ways to deny veterans' claims and reduce benefit awards. Court administrators received guidance on scheduling practices that would make it difficult for military personnel to attend hearings. While on active duty, Dr. Cross and his institute had created what amounted to a shadow legal system designed to systematically disadvantage military personnel and veterans. They used academic credibility and political connections to implement policies that weakened military morale and reduced public support for defense spending. The conspiracy's scope became clear when Santos discovered communications between institute leaders and foreign intelligence services. While no direct evidence of treason existed, the financial connections and coordinated messaging suggested influence operations designed to weaken American military capabilities from within. Representative Murphy called for a special prosecutor to investigate potential national security violations. The evidence suggested that foreign adversaries had successfully infiltrated American institutions and were using them to undermine military readiness during a time of ongoing conflict with alien threats. The revelations had immediate effects on military recruitment and retention. Young people who had been considering military service began to question whether their sacrifice would be respected. Current service members wondered if they should complete their terms or seek civilian careers where their contributions might be better. Appreciated Defense Secretary James Martinez held an emergency meeting with senior military leaders to assess the damage to military readiness. Intelligence reports showed that enemy forces were monitoring American internal discussions and planning operations based on perceived weaknesses in military morale and public support. We are facing an unprecedented attack on the foundations of military service, Secretary Martinez told his staff. The enemy has weaponized our own legal and academic institutions against us. We need to respond quickly and decisively to prevent permanent damage to our defense capabilities. The conspiracy extended beyond judges and politicians to include media personalities, academic researchers, and nonprofit organizations. All received funding from the same network of sources and promoted similar messages about reducing military influence in civilian society and questioning the value of military service. As the full scope of the network became clear, investigators realized that Jake Harrison's courthouse humiliation was not an isolated incident, but rather a planned operation designed to damage military morale and public support for veterans. The video had been too perfectly positioned to be accidental. Someone had planned for it to be recorded and widely distributed. Agent Santos obtained search warrants for Judge Wells' personal communications and discovered pre-planning for the courthouse confrontation. Wells had received instructions from Institute consultants about how to handle military personnel in her courtroom and had been specifically told to target visible symbols of military achievement like medals and uniforms. Jake Harrison stood in his kitchen reading the morning news on his tablet, coffee growing cold in his hand as he absorbed the full scope of the conspiracy that had been uncovered. The investigation had revealed that his humiliation in Judge Wells's courtroom was not an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated attack on military service and veteran dignity. The revelation filled him with anger, but also with purpose. For 2 weeks since the courthouse incident, Jake had remained largely silent while journalists, investigators, and politicians fought battles on his behalf. He appreciated their efforts, but he knew that the real fight would have to come from veterans themselves. No one else could truly understand what military service meant or defend its value with the same passion and authenticity. Jake's phone had been ringing constantly since the courthouse video went viral. News networks wanted interviews, political groups sought endorsements, and lawyers offered to file lawsuits against Judge Wells. But Jake turned down most requests. preferring to think carefully about how to respond to the crisis facing military personnel and veterans across the galaxy. The breaking point came when Jake received a call from his old squad mate, Danny Lewis, who had survived the Battle of Kepler-7 and now worked as a veterans counselor on Mars Colony. Danny's voice was strained with emotion as he described the impact of the courthouse incident on his clients. "Jake, I have veterans telling me they are ashamed to wear their uniforms in public," Danny said. "Young Marines are asking if their service matters to anyone back on Earth. Some guys are talking about ending their enlistments early because they feel like society has turned against them." The conversation continued for an hour, as Danny described the psychological damage spreading through the veteran community. Men and women who had risked everything for human civilization were questioning their worth and place in society. The conspiracy had achieved its goal of undermining military morale, and the effects were accelerating. That evening, Jake called Sergeant Bill Murphy, another Kepler-7 survivor who now ran a veterans organization in Texas. Murphy reported similar problems in his region: recruitment down 40%, veteran suicide rates climbing, and active duty personnel expressing doubt about their mission and purpose. "We need to fight back, sir," Murphy said, using Jake's old rank out of habit. "These people are trying to destroy everything we stand for. We cannot let them win." Jake spent the next 3 days developing a plan. He would not respond to the attacks with anger or political rhetoric. Instead, he would organize a positive campaign that reminded society why military service mattered and why veterans deserved respect and support. The campaign would be led by veterans themselves, telling their own stories in their own words. Jake announced his plans in a video message posted on social media. He wore his dress uniform with full decorations, including the Medal of Honor that Judge Wells had forced him to remove. The video was simple and direct, filmed in his living room with no special effects or professional production. "My name is Jake Harrison, and I am a United States Marine," he began. "2 weeks ago, a federal judge ordered me to remove my Medal of Honor because she found it inappropriate and disrespectful. I want to tell you why she was wrong." Jake spent 10 minutes explaining what the Medal of Honor represented: not personal glory, but recognition of service to others. He described the Battle of Kepler-7, the civilians who were saved, and the Marines who died protecting them. He spoke without notes, his words carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the experiences he described. "This medal does not belong to me," Jake continued, holding the decoration up to the camera. "It belongs to every person who puts on a uniform and promises to defend others. It belongs to the families who worry while their loved ones serve in dangerous places. It belongs to the children who grow up free because brave people stood between them and those who would do them harm." The video ended with Jake announcing the formation of Honor the Service, a grassroots organization dedicated to supporting military personnel and veterans while educating civilians about the value of military service. He invited other veterans to share their stories and join the movement to restore respect for those who served. Within hours, the video had millions of views and thousands of responses from veterans across human space. Active duty personnel shared it on military networks, while veteran organizations pledged their support for Jake's campaign. The response was overwhelming and immediate. Jake's next step was to organize a series of speaking events at military bases, veteran hospitals, and community centers. He would travel across the galaxy if necessary to personally meet with service members and veterans who had been affected by the conspiracy's attacks on military morale. His first stop was the Marine base where he had trained as a young recruit 20 years earlier. The commanding officer, Colonel Sandra Price, arranged for Jake to speak to all personnel during evening chow. The base auditorium was packed with Marines of all ranks. From fresh recruits to senior officers, Jake spoke without prepared remarks, sharing his experiences from basic training through combat on Kepler-7 to the recent courthouse incident. He talked about the honor of serving alongside brave men and women, the satisfaction of protecting innocent people, and the bonds forged in shared sacrifice and common purpose. "Some people want us to feel ashamed of our service," Jake told the Marines. "They want us to apologize for being warriors in a dangerous galaxy. But I am here to tell you that what we do matters. When civilians sleep safely in their beds, it is because Marines stand watch. When children play in colony playgrounds, it is because we keep the wolves away. The response was electric. Marines who had been questioning their purpose found renewed pride in their service. Officers reported that morale improved dramatically after Jake's visit, with re-enlistment rates returning to normal levels within days. Jake's message was simple but powerful. Military service was honorable work performed by honorable people for honorable reasons. No amount of political manipulation or propaganda could change the fundamental truth that civilization required defenders, and those defenders deserved respect and support from the society they protected. The Honor the Service movement grew rapidly as veterans across human space organized local chapters and events. They held memorial services for fallen comrades, community education programs about military service, and support groups for veterans struggling with civilian life. The movement was grassroots and authentic, driven by people who had lived the experiences they described. Jake also reached out to military families, understanding that spouses, children, and parents served alongside their uniformed loved ones. He spoke at family readiness group meetings, base spouse clubs, and military family support events. His message to families was that their sacrifice and support were essential parts of military service. Military families served too, Jake explained to a gathering of Navy spouses. When your husband deploys to defend a distant colony, you serve. When your wife works long hours preparing for combat missions, you serve. When your children adapt to military life and frequent moves, they serve. You all deserve recognition and respect for your contributions. The movement's impact extended beyond morale improvement to practical results. Congressional representatives began receiving thousands of calls from constituents supporting military personnel and veterans. Local communities organized honor guards for military funerals, welcome home ceremonies for returning units, and support programs for veteran families. Jake insisted that the movement remain nonpartisan and focused on supporting service members rather than attacking their critics. When some supporters wanted to organize protests against Judge Wells or the Institute for Peace and Prosperity, Jake discouraged such activities. The goal was to build up military service, not tear down opposition. We do not need to attack our critics, Jake explained in another video message. We just need to tell our truth. When people understand what military service really means, they will support it naturally. Our job is education, not confrontation. The movement's positive approach attracted support from unexpected sources. Civilian employers began creating veteran hiring programs. Universities established scholarship funds for military families, and community organizations adopted local military units for support and recognition. Jake's personal story became a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of unjust treatment. Rather than seeking revenge against Judge Wells or demanding apologies from his critics, he chose to focus on the future and the work that needed to be done to support current and future service members. The movement's success was measured not in political victories or media coverage, but in the restored pride and confidence of military personnel and veterans across human space. Recruitment numbers began to recover, veteran suicide rates declined, and military families reported feeling more supported by their communities. Jake Harrison stood in his kitchen reading the morning news on his tablet, coffee growing cold in his hand as he absorbed the full scope of the conspiracy that had been uncovered. The investigation had revealed that his humiliation in Judge Wells's courtroom was not an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated attack on military service and veteran dignity. The revelation filled him with anger, but also with purpose. For 2 weeks since the courthouse incident, Jake had remained largely silent while journalists, investigators, and politicians fought battles on his behalf. He appreciated their efforts, but he knew that the real fight would have to come from veterans themselves. No one else could truly understand what military service meant or defend its value with the same passion and authenticity. Jake's phone had been ringing constantly since the courthouse video went viral. News networks wanted interviews, political groups sought endorsements, and lawyers offered to file lawsuits against Judge Wells. But Jake turned down most requests, preferring to think carefully about how to respond to the crisis facing military personnel and veterans across the galaxy. The breaking point came when Jake received a call from his old squad mate, Danny Lewis, who had survived the Battle of Kepler-7 and now worked as a veterans counselor on Mars Colony. Danny's voice was strained with emotion as he described the impact of the courthouse incident on his clients. Jake, I have veterans telling me they are ashamed to wear their uniforms in public, Danny said. Young Marines are asking if their service matters to anyone back on Earth. Some guys are talking about ending their enlistments early because they feel like society has turned against them. The conversation continued for an hour, as Danny described the psychological damage spreading through the veteran community. Men and women who had risked everything for human civilization were questioning their worth and place in society. The conspiracy had achieved its goal of undermining military morale, and the effects were accelerating. That evening, Jake called Sergeant Bill Murphy, another Kepler-7 survivor who now ran a veterans organization in Texas. Murphy reported similar problems in his region: recruitment down 40%, veteran suicide rates climbing, and active duty personnel expressing doubt about their mission and purpose. We need to fight back. Sir, Murphy said, using Jake's old rank out of habit. These people are trying to destroy everything we stand for. We cannot let them win. Jake spent the next 3 days developing a plan. He would not respond to the attacks with anger or political rhetoric. Instead, he would organize a positive campaign that reminded society why military service mattered and why veterans deserved respect and support. The campaign would be led by veterans themselves, telling their own stories in their own words. Jake announced his plans in a video message posted on social media. He wore his dress uniform with full decorations, including the Medal of Honor that Judge Wells had forced him to remove. The video was simple and direct, filmed in his living room with no special effects or professional production. My name is Jake Harrison, and I am a United States Marine, he began. 2 weeks ago, a federal judge ordered me to remove my Medal of Honor because she found it inappropriate and disrespectful. I want to tell you why she was wrong. Jake spent 10 minutes explaining what the Medal of Honor represented, not personal glory, but recognition of service to others. He described the Battle of Kepler-7, the civilians who were saved, and the Marines who died protecting them. He spoke without notes, his words carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the experiences he described. This medal does not belong to me, Jake continued, holding the decoration up to the camera. It belongs to every person who puts on a uniform and promises to defend others. It belongs to the families who worry while their loved ones serve in dangerous places. It belongs to the children who grow up free because brave people stood between them and those who would do them harm. The video ended with Jake announcing the formation of Honor the Service, a grassroots organization dedicated to supporting military personnel and veterans while educating civilians about the value of military service. He invited other veterans to share their stories and join the movement to restore respect for those who served. Within hours, the video had millions of views and thousands of responses from veterans across human space. Active duty personnel shared it on military networks, while veteran organizations pledged their support for Jake's campaign. The response was overwhelming and immediate. Jake's next step was to organize a series of speaking events at military bases, veteran hospitals, and community centers. He would travel across the galaxy if necessary to personally meet with service members and veterans who had been affected by the conspiracy's attacks on military morale. His first stop was the Marine base where he had trained as a young recruit 20 years earlier. The commanding officer, Colonel Sandra Price, arranged for Jake to speak to all personnel during evening chow. The base auditorium was packed with Marines of all ranks. From fresh recruits to senior officers, Jake spoke without prepared remarks, sharing his experiences from basic training through combat on Kepler-7 to the recent courthouse incident. He talked about the honor of serving alongside brave men and women, the satisfaction of protecting innocent people, and the bonds forged in shared sacrifice and common purpose. Some people want us to feel ashamed of our service, Jake told the Marines. They want us to apologize for being warriors in a dangerous galaxy, but I am here to tell you that what we do matters. When civilians sleep safely in their beds, it is because Marines stand watch. When children play in colony playgrounds, it is because we keep the wolves away. The response was electric. Marines who had been questioning their purpose found renewed pride in their service. Officers reported that morale improved dramatically after Jake's visit, with re-enlistment rates returning to normal levels within days. Jake's message was simple but powerful. Military service was honorable work performed by honorable people for honorable reasons. No amount of political manipulation or propaganda could change the fundamental truth that civilization required defenders, and those defenders deserved respect and support from the society they protected. The Honor the Service movement grew rapidly as veterans across human space organized local chapters and events. They held memorial services for fallen comrades, community education programs about military service, and support groups for veterans struggling with civilian life. The movement was grassroots and authentic, driven by people who had lived the experiences they described. Jake also reached out to military families, understanding that spouses, children, and parents served alongside their uniformed loved ones. He spoke at family readiness group meetings, base spouse clubs, and military family support events. His message to families was that their sacrifice and support were essential parts of military service. Military families serve too, Jake explained to a gathering of Navy spouses. When your husband deploys to defend a distant colony, you serve. When your wife works long hours preparing for combat missions, you serve. When your children adapt to military life and frequent moves, they serve. You all deserve recognition and respect for your contributions. The movement's impact extended beyond morale improvement to practical results. Congressional representatives began receiving thousands of calls from constituents supporting military personnel and veterans. Local communities organized honor guards for military funerals, welcome home ceremonies for returning units, and support programs for veteran families. Jake insisted that the movement remain nonpartisan and focused on supporting service members rather than attacking their critics. When some supporters wanted to organize protests against Judge Wells or the Institute for Peace and Prosperity, Jake discouraged such activities. The goal was to build up military service, not tear down opposition. "We do not need to attack our critics," Jake explained in another video message. "We just need to tell our truth. When people understand what military service really means, they will support it naturally. Our job is education, not confrontation." The movement's positive approach attracted support from unexpected sources. Civilian employers began creating veteran hiring programs. Universities established scholarship funds for military families, and community organizations adopted local military units for support and recognition. Jake's personal story became a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of unjust treatment. Rather than seeking revenge against Judge Wells or demanding apologies from his critics, he chose to focus on the future and the work that needed to be done to support current and future service members. The movement's success was measured not in political victories or media coverage, but in the restored pride and confidence of military personnel and veterans across human space. Recruitment numbers began to recover, veteran suicide rates declined, and military families reported feeling more supported by their communities. The Senate trial of Judge Patricia Wells began 6 months after the courthouse incident that had shocked the galaxy. The chamber was packed with spectators, including dozens of veterans wearing their dress uniforms as a show of support for Jake Harrison and military service in general. The proceedings were broadcast live across human space, with millions watching to see if justice would be served. Senator Helen Murphy, now chairing the impeachment committee, called the session to order at 9 in the morning. The charges against Judge Wells were serious: abuse of judicial power, financial corruption, and conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. If convicted, she would be removed from office and barred from holding federal positions in the future. The prosecution team, led by Special Prosecutor David Kim, opened with a presentation of evidence that had been gathered over months of investigation. Financial records showed Wells had received hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments from organizations connected to the Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Bank statements revealed luxury purchases and investments that could not be explained by her judicial salary alone. Members of the Senate, Prosecutor Kim began, "The evidence will show that Judge Wells systematically abused her position to advance a political agenda hostile to military service. She accepted payments from organizations dedicated to undermining military morale and veteran support. She used her courtroom as a weapon against the very people who defend our civilization." The first witness was FBI agent Maria Santos, who had led the investigation into the conspiracy surrounding Judge Wells. Santos testified about the network of anti-military organizations that had funded sympathetic judges, politicians, and media figures. She presented wiretapped conversations and intercepted communications that showed coordination between Wells and Institute operatives. Judge Wells was not acting alone, Agent Santos explained. She was part of a sophisticated network designed to systematically disadvantage military personnel and veterans in civilian courts. The courthouse incident with Mr. Harrison was not spontaneous. It was planned and orchestrated to achieve maximum damage to military morale. The prosecution then called several veterans who had appeared before Judge Wells in various legal proceedings. Their testimony painted a picture of systematic bias and hostility toward military service. Army veteran Carol Martinez described how Wells had questioned her motives for enlisting and suggested she was seeking undeserved sympathy from taxpayers. Judge Wells told me that military service was a personal choice and did not entitle me to special consideration, Martinez testified. She said people who join the military should expect to be injured and should not burden society with their problems. Afterward, Navy veteran Robert Johnson testified about his disability hearing in Wells's court. Despite clear medical evidence of service-connected injuries, Wells had denied his claim and suggested he was exaggerating his condition to avoid work. Johnson's testimony was particularly powerful because his injuries were visible. He had lost his left arm defending a space station against Zephyrian raiders. The defense team, led by prominent attorney Lisa Chen, argued that Judge Wells had been within her rights to maintain courtroom decorum and that the charges against her were politically motivated. They claimed the prosecution was trying to criminalize judicial discretion and create special privileges for military personnel that did not exist under the law. Judge Wells may have been insensitive in her handling of Mr. Harrison's case, Attorney Chen argued, but insensitivity is not a crime. Federal judges have broad authority to control their courtrooms, and they cannot be removed from office simply because some people disagree with their decisions, the defense called character. Witnesses who described Wells as a dedicated public servant who had worked tirelessly to ensure equal treatment under the law. They argued that her rulings in military-related cases were based on legal precedent rather than personal bias, and that any appearance of anti-military sentiment was coincidental. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Financial records showed clear connections between Wells' personal enrichment and her judicial decisions. Expert witnesses testified that her sentencing patterns in military-related cases deviated significantly from legal norms and statistical averages. Dr. Sarah Wilson, a military psychologist who had appeared before Wells's court, provided damaging testimony about the judge's behavior during proceedings. Wilson described how Wells would make inappropriate comments about military culture and question whether veterans deserved public sympathy for their service-related problems. Judge Wells created a hostile environment for any veteran appearing in her court, Dr. Wilson testified. Her questions and comments were designed to humiliate and intimidate people who had already suffered trauma in service to their country. This was not judicial discretion. This was systematic abuse of power. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Jake Harrison himself took the witness stand. He wore his dress uniform with full decorations, including the Medal of Honor, that had started the whole controversy. The chamber fell silent as he was sworn in and took his seat. Jake's testimony was simple and direct. He described the courthouse incident without emotion, focusing on facts rather than feelings. He explained what the Medal of Honor meant to him and to the military community, and why Judge Wells' order to remove it had been so harmful to military morale. The Medal of Honor represents sacrifice and service, Jake testified. When Judge Wells ordered me to remove it, she was not just disrespecting me, she was disrespecting every person who has ever worn our nation's uniform. She was telling the galaxy that military service has no value in civilian society. Under cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to suggest that Jake had worn his uniform to intimidate other participants in the custody hearing. Jake's response was measured and thoughtful, explaining that he wore the uniform to show respect for the court and the legal process. "I served my country for 20 years, Jake said. "I earned the right to wear this uniform and these decorations." Judge Wells had no legal authority to order me to remove them, and her decision to do so revealed her bias against military service. The prosecution also presented evidence about the broader conspiracy involving the Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Agent Santos testified about financial connections between the Institute and foreign intelligence services, suggesting that the attack on military morale was part of a broader effort to weaken human defense capabilities. Admiral Carl Rogers testified about the impact of the anti-military campaign on military readiness and recruitment. He presented classified intelligence showing that enemy propaganda increasingly focused on divisions within human society, using the courthouse incident and similar events to argue that resistance to alien threats was futile. The enemies of human civilization understand that they cannot defeat our military forces in direct combat, Admiral Rogers explained. So they attack our morale, our unity, and our commitment to defending each other. Judge Wells became a weapon in their arsenal, whether she realized it or not. The defense struggled to counter the weight of evidence presented by the prosecution. Their attempts to portray Wells as a victim of political persecution fell flat when confronted with clear financial records and testimony from multiple witnesses about systematic bias and misconduct. After 3 weeks of testimony and deliberation, the Senate voted on the impeachment charges. The vote was unanimous. All 100 senators voted to convict Judge Wells on all charges and remove her from office. The margin reflected the overwhelming evidence of corruption and misconduct, as well as bipartisan outrage at the treatment of military personnel and veterans. Judge Wells was immediately escorted from the courthouse by federal marshals. Her law license was suspended pending criminal proceedings, and she faced federal charges for corruption, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The woman who had once wielded enormous power over military personnel and their families now faced years in federal prison. The Institute for Peace and Prosperity was also dismantled following the trial. Dr. Richard Cross and several of his associates were indicted on charges related to conspiracy and foreign influence operations. Their funding sources were frozen, and their network of sympathetic judges, politicians, and media figures was exposed and discredited. The trial's impact extended far beyond the fate of Judge Wells herself. Congress passed the Veterans Dignity Act within weeks of her conviction, establishing strict protections for military personnel and veterans in civilian courts. The law prohibited discrimination based on military service and created oversight mechanisms to prevent judicial bias. Jake Harrison was invited to the White House for the bill signing ceremony, where President Martinez praised his dignity and courage in the face of unjust treatment. The ceremony was attended by veterans from across the galaxy, including several of Jake's old comrades from the Battle of Kepler 7. Today we reaffirm our commitment to the men and women who defend our civilization, President Martinez said as he signed the legislation. We will not allow anyone to diminish their service or question their worth. Military service is honorable work performed by honorable people, and it will be treated as such.